Hello and welcome to Varn Blog, and today I am here with Dr. Justin Sledge of the channel Esoterica, and we are talking about the somewhat unexpected intersection of dialectical and historical materialism, esoteric topics, and politics. Um, Something that I was recently reading, Minimum Moralia, where Adorno goes off on the esoteric for like, I don't know, a chapter. And So it's not immediately obvious that those three categories have anything to do with each other.
Mhm.
And you've recently also done an episode on the resurrection of a certain conspiracy about Marxism, going all the way back to um, an Austrian anti-communist whose name has slipped my mind. The Immunize Eschaton guy.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I know you're talking about. I can't remember. Yeah,
Yeah.
Von Mies or whatever. Not Von Mies.
No, it's not Von Mies, but it's like Von Luden or
Yeah.
Von Kuhn-Lunden or something like that. James Lindsay's the stupid version of it for
No,
people.
right. Yeah, Lindsay's the kind of he's resurrected it, and some other people as well.
So we'll start there for the overlap, because you've recently done an episode on the esoteric Marx and how there probably isn't such a thing, and the esoteric Hegel, which there probably is, but it's a little bit overstated. You went through the work of McGee in his book Hegel and Hermeticism, a book I really like, actually, but you seem to think that McGee probably takes the argument a little bit too far. Why? I have found it actually increasingly important, though, to understand the Christian and religious notions of a lot of things that would later become political notions. And German idealism, you kind of can't get around Christian theology running through it in various ways. So, in that sense, I do find it interesting that there's been a renewed interest in the theological underpinnings of a lot of what we might call modern politics or political theology or something like that. Although I'm hesitant to say political theology a la Carl Schmitt, because I don't like Smithian arguments. But I wanted to ask you a little bit, like, what prompted you to make that video on esoteric Marxism and esoteric Hegelianism, and because that's literally probably the only time I've seen you touch on politics on the channel.
Yeah, very rarely do I touch politics on the channel, just because I it's not the mandate of the channel, and I think we could all use spaces that stay in their lane. If your channel's a political channel, great, but if it's not, don't make it one. In my opinion. I don't know. It was May Day. I have a background in Marx. I've written on Marx. I wrote a dissertation on Marx. So he's someone I know pretty well. So one, it was kind of easy to do because I know that stuff pretty well. And it was the week of May Day. So I decided to make a May Day episode. And also I just get constantly these questions about, hey, what about this guy who says that Marxism and wokeism is all Gnosticism or Hermeticism or whatever? And it's such a bizarre argument that I had to check it out, and of course it's completely specious. It's funny that I mentioned Hegel and the Hermetic Tradition by Glenn Alexander McGee, and after the episode he wrote me a very long email, which I'm going to respond to at some point, and I'm going to bring him on the show because I want to really accurately represent his position. And he's updated apparently things in his argument since that book has come out, to strengthen his position to his mind. I'd like to get more into that. But the basic argument is that yes, there is some influence of Hermeticism in Hegel, or the occult in Hegel. There's actually the influence of that on basically everyone at that time. It's not unique to Hegel. It's Schelling and even Schopenhauer and other people were deeply influenced by what we might call esoteric currents. So it's not unique to Hegel at all. And I don't know that I don't know if it's central to the degree to which maybe McGee thinks it is. But again, he's a scholar. He's the expert on that, and I'm not. So I want folks to hear his argument out. But yeah, I think the basic reason why I made it is just to show that this argument that Marxism has an esoteric dimension is not ipso facto true the way that Lindsay and other people present it. Now, that's not to say it's not, as you said, it's not baked in with elements um, of Christian apocalypticism, which I do think it is very much baked in with a kind of materialist apocalypticism. And I don't think those kinds of apocalypticisms are totally divorceable from one another. And I think even Marx knew that, and I think that's why you see him very rarely speculate on the future of things. He does it for a couple of paragraphs in the German ideology, and then basically by Das Kapital, you don't see anything like that at all anymore. He doesn't do that kind of speculation, and I think he knew it too. I think he knew that it had this kind of apocalyptic tenor that he wanted to avoid. Um, that really emerged in the Second International in a really dramatic way. That the Second International, I think, was its economism was baked in with messianic expectation and things like that. So, but yeah, that's basically why I made it. I don't. And again, I think I made that episode. Um, I don't think I said anything terribly extraordinary. It's
Nope.
mostly just like if you understand Marx's project, it's not going to be the case that any elements of esotericism to be found in Hegelianism are going to survive into the system. And frankly, I don't even think that if they were in the system, which they are, I don't think Marx ever understood them. I don't think he had the acumen or the historical background to really even, you know, tease out what's a theosophical Yakov Bermian kind of element operating in Hegel's logic or something. I don't think Marx would have known that if it had bit him.
Yeah, that's something that has occurred to me too. When Marx's writings on religion are scant, somewhat insightful to some degree, and easily misapplied. Like this sort of my take on it. I mean, if I was gonna parse out like structural weirdnesses in Marxism, I would be far more interested in looking at like the way lingering Epicureanism might be affecting it or
Sure,
something.
wrote his dissertation on Epicurus.
Right.
Yeah, and he's knee deep in that world. He certainly has a good understanding of Lucretius and Democritus and those guys. But again, like, does he know the first thing about Joachim of Fior? I'm very doubtful.
Yeah, I highly doubt it too. Like,
but is he operating under a rubric that's influenced by Joachim of Fior via Hegel? Yeah, of course he is, and we all are at some level. I mean, the fact that we refer to a time period as the Middle Ages, like there's the idea that that was the middle, and we're at the end. Like that is a Joachimian way of parsing time. And so even the idea that there's a Middle Ages to be talked about at all, the fact that we even use that language, shows that we have been how deep that influence has actually gone. And most people would never heard of Joachim of Fior, but they live in his world, whether they know it or not.
so you mentioned to me off air that you wrote your dissertation on Marx, right?
Yeah, that's right.
What elements of Marxist thought interest you, and then we might talk about how that relates to esoteric stuff now.
So there's a long story and a short story. The long story, or the short story rather, is that by the time I was finishing graduate school, I was bad for the department, and the department wanted to see me go, and I wanted to be out of there. And they basically said, "Look, you need to write something and get done and get out of here." And like, your best option is to write on a major figure. That's going to be your best chances for getting a job. You know, dissertations are weird. They want them to be obscure in some sense, but they have to be marketable on the other. So you have to pick something very obscure and something that's very well known, and you have to be able to go to the philosophy conferences or whatever and give an elevator pitch, and hopefully someone will give you a job, which is a pipe dream. At any rate, I wanted to be out of there, and the easiest way for me to write a dissertation was either to write a dissertation on Western Esotericism, which is something I knew a lot about, and I knew that road was going to be immediately blocked, and it was no doubt blocked. No chance of doing that. And the other thing was like, well, I knew a lot about Marx, and so I was like, I'll write in Marx. And I did sort of a literature survey, which I knew the literature pretty well, and I came to the realization that no one had ever done an analysis of Marx's metaethics, Well, there've been a lot of written on Marx and ethics, but not Marxist metaethics. And so basically what I did is I went to the Gesamtaufgabe and just basically tracked Marx's metaethics from, very early on all the way to basically the end. And then showed how um, tensions in Marx's metaethics, tensions he never resolved and probably was never even totally conscious of, how those tensions actually played themselves out later on in the development of Marxism. And so, we had used, some of Lukács, some Trotsky, other kinds of Marxists, some folks on writing on Marxism and the law, how the law is to be like vouchsafed, especially in the early Soviet Union. And so I really looked at how these unresolved issues in Marxism had a kind of butterfly effect into the development of Marxism, especially in its development philosophically in the second and third internationals, but also how those questions began to keep cropping up, and thinkers like, thinkers like Trotsky and stuff like that. So I think it's an interesting dissertation. I don't know if it'll ever see the light of day. I don't know if anyone cares to read it. But it is, again, it's one of these, whether we like it or not, there's a lot of people moldering in their graves because of, being killed by Marxists of various kinds, and that there are millions of people in the ground because Marxists killed them, and they killed them because they were doing the business of building up socialism to their mind. And I find that, when a bunch of people end up in mass graves, which again, like they did, we should ask ourselves questions about what are the kinds of reasons why they ended up in those mass graves, and if we can trace that back to unresolved philosophical problems at the very beginning of the project, I think that's non-trivial and maybe even essential. And so that's kind of why I decided to do the dissertation that I did. Anyway, I wrote the whole damn thing in like 6 months. I was out. So I was like, all right, pull the Band-Aid off, be done with graduate school, get the letters by your name, tip out.
Wow. It's impressive that you got the dissertation done that quickly. I didn't even write my master's thesis in that amount of time. So
it was a quick write. And it's a question I thought about before. And it was just, again, interesting that lots of people had tried to write books of Marxist ethics, either practical texts like Tactic and Ethics and stuff like that by Lukács, where they're just like, this is how we do ethics, like, on the ground, which is not a terribly great time to be figuring out your ethics when you're like deciding whether or not you should shoot people. And Lukács did have people shot. And so, you don't want to build your ethics in a rush. It's not a great idea. And, you have Trotsky stuff on the dialectic of ends and means and stuff like that. And, it's interesting that people had attempted to build a Marxist ethics, but no one had thought about what are the underlying principles out of which any Marxist ethics could be built. And to my mind, Marx himself never resolved those issues. They remained. He was totally happy to critique utilitarianism, totally happy to critique Kant, but he was never capable of building out a robust systematic moral theory. And again, there's something interesting about that, because so much of what he does is capitalism is bad. Well, on what grounds? On what grounds can you morally judge the capitalists as a class? And I think that's a fascinating problem, and Marx never solved it. I think it remains unsolved, basically.
The meta ethics of Marxism is interesting. I tend to myself end up being some kind of virtue ethicist. However, figuring out the constellation of where your virtues come from within the Marx world is actually kind of more fraught than obvious. So.
No, you're absolutely right. And and ultimately, I can come to the conclusion that Marx himself was a kind of a virtue ethicist. That when he his favorite character in history is Spartacus, and he always talks about virtues. He really talks, and this is also a function of him being a Victorian gentleman. That was a very virtue ethics driven type of society. Victorian ethics were very virtue driven, and Marx himself, I think, was influenced by that kind of what we might call ideology, or whatever. So yeah, I agree with you. I think that because of the material theory of history, there'll never be Marxism is neither moral relativism, nor is it the kind of logical, deductive moral logic that you get from utilitarianism or deontology, but it actually is a kind of um, relatively hard virtue ethics.
Yeah, it's interesting you come to that conclusion. This is just it's been my intuition as a person who's taught ethical philosophy for a long time and tried to deal with the way Marxists have and mostly have not handled it, which ends up in a morass of amoralism a lot of the times where the ends justify the means without really dealing with the fact that ends and means start collapsing at a certain point.
Right.
Um,
Right. And this is what
even in
Trotsky
Marx,
says.
right? Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's I mean, I think that the big Trotsky book on that's the debates he had with Kotsky on the terror, right? Like,
Yeah.
um,
Well,
and-
Trotsky wrote a whole book on ethics.
um, oh yeah, I guess he did. And I think
Mhm.
going back through my Trotsky in my head,
Yeah, he wrote again. This is one of these weird things where, yeah, and his argument basically was that the ends and the means have a dialectical relationship, which I'm fine with that. Um, but the question is, what establishes the ends? And and so if you don't have a moral justification for the ends, then the dialect doesn't start. And so I do think it collapses in amoralism. And again, that's not a thing that I want. Yeah, it's not a thing as a Jewish person who is pretty dedicated to a world in which, having been the victims of mass murder, politically motivated mass murder, and actively now engaged in the genocide of the Gazan people, we've been both victims and perpetrators of kinds of genocide. And I don't know. I don't want to sail into thinking through these problems in a way that you get the political suspension of the ethical. I think that's a disaster. It's a real disaster.
well, I mean, the political suspension of the ethical is even somewhat obvious in trying to figure out the USSR's stance towards, say, Israel historically, which
Hmm.
a lot of people are surprised when I point out that the Soviet Union actually supported the creation of the state of Israel more than the US did initially. And Stalin's reasons for that are complicated, partly seemingly having to do with the failed Jewish oblast, partly
Yeah.
seemingly had to do with uh, Lenin's answer in the national question, except that he goes further than Lenin and recognized Jews as a people having a nation, but also partly seemingly tied to anti-Semitism and Stalin himself. Those are all seemingly evident.
Yeah,
So
it's all wrapped up together in Stalin, and I do agree that the USR's um, quite violent oscillations on what to do with the Jewish question, from basically nearly state-sanctioned anti-Semitism to clear statements against anti-Semitism and Lenin and things like that. Yeah, it's a super complicated thing, and I think this is also a place for me where I think about the Soviet Union, where what I want to do with the Soviet Union is let it be complicated, and I think that's where you know people on the left and certainly many other liberals just can't let it be complicated. But it was incredibly complicated, and when you're building socialism, something that has basically never existed before, um, I mean, who knows what you're going to come up with? And I neither want to overly celebrate the Soviet Union, nor do I want to be in a position where everything it did was bad and it was just a deformed worker state, and whatever. I don't know, whatever the thing you're supposed to say about it is. But
I think today it's that it was good. Like just unequivocally. No, I mean, like Trotskyism is on a worldwide decline right now. So
yeah, of course, yeah, Trotskyism is. I mean, it's never been a popular thing, really. But yeah, again, I think these for me as a Leninist, right? Concrete analysis of concrete conditions. You're not going to get out saying it was good or bad. It's not concrete analysis of concrete conditions.
bingo.
Like, the Soviet Union of the NEP is a very different thing than the Soviet Union of Brezhnev, and so I think you just have to, you have to analyze it where it was at that time and what issue you're trying to deal with, whether it's the treatment of the Jews or state atheism or central planning or whatever. And so um, I the Soviet Union went through more tectonic changes in its history than most other nations did at the same time, because of the massive social economic changes it was undergoing. So, yeah, I'm not going to get on the it was good or bad train. To me,
Yeah.
that's just like not good historical materialism.
When you're accelerating through what took other countries 300 to 500 years to develop in about 40,
Yeah,
stuff is about to be a little bit tumultuous.
yeah,
I think that's a fair
yeah,
assertion.
absolutely. Yeah, same is true with China.
Right.
I think I think for me, it's like a methodological question. If I'm going to be a Marxist and try to look at it through the lens of historical materialism, um, it's going to require a lot of really careful study, which frankly we don't have. We don't have good studies because the Soviet Union itself wasn't terribly honest about what it was up to. The Western powers weren't honest about what was going on in the Soviet Union, so we have a lot of really unreliable data, and which also makes me glad I'm just not in that world anymore. Like I've become just like the most boring kind of Marxist imaginable. I'm like, I was talking to some friends of mine in Spain,
Mm-hmm.
and they were like, "You remind me of my like great grandparents. Like you're just like you're a Marxist from like 1925." I'm like, "Yeah, that's my Marxism. I like my Marxism like I like my wine, real old."
Yeah, I am also of I'm your great granddad's Marxist.
Yeah, just like an old trade unionist. Like, yeah,
um, I guess the interesting thing about ambiguities, I obsess over ambiguities in Marx. It's not just like the meta ethical question has actually occurred to me, but I've never like tried to systematize it. I've been more interested in ambiguities in Marxist theory of mind,
mm,
which I think is related to the meta ethical question because there's a lot. There is this idea of emergence, and then there's this idea of structure, which I think both the like Marxist humanist without the hyphen, because that's a very specific group of Marxists, and we're gonna have to
right.
go through our various. This is like dealing with Protestants. There's just too many.
The
Um,
alphabet soup of Marxists.
right. Um, so you have that kind of emergence view of ideas, but it emerges from the natural world, and humans kind of recognize things for what they are and their use and how they fit into their particular mode of social reproduction at any given time. And then but that's a very hazy worked out notion of where ideas come from.
Right.
And then you have the structural notions that get more worked out later by people like Bukharin or Althusser, and not that they are one to one with each other at all, but that's what they're trying to do.
Right.
Um, and it seems to me that both things are in Marx. Like there's just a lot of ambiguities in Marx that people don't want to deal with as ambiguities. And this brings it up to what I see you do on your channel actually a little bit. And this is one of the things that's related is trying to strip away later, even academic presumptions when you read a text or even reading a text. Like, we know that this author thought this 20 years later. Let's read this back into this text in the early period. And Marxists are notorious at doing that with Marx. Like, we're reading like stuff from like Critique of the Goethe Program all the way back in like 1844 or some shit.
Right.
And it's that,
Orthodoxy.
yeah.
There's a tendency toward in the same way that
Mhm.
Greek writers came back and said, "Oh yeah, everything Plato and Aristotle said was one theory that never had contradictions," and also Plato and Aristotle agreed with each other. Like these bizarre impositions, because it was the development of an orthodoxy, and this is one of the things that Marx went through was the development of an orthodoxy, which is hilarious considering that the political and economic manuscripts of 1844 weren't even printed until the 30s. Like
Right.
Lenin never even saw those. um, so, and it's also just like I find it just grating because it's the idea that Marx like had like a mystical revelation of socialism and then like never changed his mind. It's the most immaterial theory of intellectual development. It's just the imposition of orthodoxy upon a thinker, which I find bizarre. Because it's again, that impulse is not an actual Marxist impulse. That is a religious impulse to like the gospel of Marx, Marxianity, And I agree with you that it's there's not only are there ambiguities, Marx just changes his mind. I mean, and even the things that we say I love when people correct Marx. Like, see people say things like, You can only get to socialism through violent social revolution. That's the only way to do it. Violence is the only mechanism by which to achieve socialism. And Marx clearly says, like, I think the French could just vote it in. He says that in the Brumaire. Like, it's like the French are an advanced enough society they could just vote socialism in. It could be achieved through parliamentary means. And because that disrupts what Marx is supposed to say, Marx really didn't say that. You know, or the same thing happened with Lenin, you know, when the fascists were really coming to power in Kerensky's government, Lenin told the Bolsheviks to vote for Kerensky because it was like, you can't build, you're going to fight fascism and build, so like, no, we got us to build socialism on the foundations of civil society. And Kerensky represents civil society. Now, obviously, he's not the end of all of it. We're going to have to overthrow him eventually, but we can't build socialism on top of fascism. And there's a moment where, like, you hear Marxists like, I never would do this, that, and the other. And I'm like, Lenin told them to vote for Kerensky. Like, are you more of a Marxist than Lenin? It's just, yeah, these kinds of orthodoxies strike me as just, again, they're born out of a religious impulse. And it's not surprising to find people who are often deeply religious convert to Marxism because it can function as a kind of religion.
That reminds me of Althusser, actually, who was a deep Catholic.
Like, you know, I think Althusser is a perfect example of a person who really wanted to have it like several ways, 3 ways really. He wanted to have this grand unified theory that reconciled Catholicism and Marxism, and also he wanted to do it along this very odd line where he wanted the sort of younger Marx and the later Marx to be distinct in very absolute terms, which I'm still sympathetic to that analysis. Maybe not as sympathetic as the early Althusser was enthusiastic about it, but I'm still, as you know, I identify as a structural Marxist. I think there are 3 of us left. We are the dinosaurs of Marxism for sure.
Yeah, well, structural Marxism has kind of, to some degree, fallen away. I think part of that has to do with Team France's turn to post-structuralism being blamed on Althusser. And I think the other part of it, you know, I think about a friend of mine who asked a professor why he wasn't an Althusserian, and he I think responded like, well, he killed his wife. Like,
it's a bad look.
Like, and Nicholas Poulantzas killed himself. So maybe even if it's true, it's not.
Not just that. I mean, one of Althusser's students shot himself. There was a wave of suicides and stuff like that around Althusser. It was a very, a lot of tragedies. You know, I think he was dating Lacan's daughter or something.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, which gives him this weird relationship to Bataille too. But anyway, right.
Well, yeah, but Bataille had his wife stolen by Lacan.
Yeah,
he's still your girl. Yeah, you know, those are all bad optics. But also, Althusser he suffered from severe mental health problems. I think we need to. Everyone tells a story about how he killed his wife, but we also have to talk about that in the context of, you know, Althusser never taught an entire semester class without being institutionalized. Ever. He was institutionalized at some point in every semester. He suffered from severe mental health challenges. And I think it's, it bleeds, it leads. Like, you know, he killed his wife and that sort of like, but I think we have to put that in the context of a much longer arc of his mental health, which was terribly fragile. And also his mental health was very fragile, and he was basically not reinventing Marxism, but he was wrestling Marxism away from orthodoxy. And it's easy for us to forget that this is Althusser in the mid 60s, this is when Stalinism and all the things that Stalinism did were becoming clear. It's like the whole Lysenkoism, all that stuff. There was a moment where you could no longer just be an orthodox Marxist. That was simply not possible anymore. And there was no other theory to replace it. You know, it's something kind of like the Galileo moment where Copernicus had shown that the world was, the Earth was, the sun was not this, the Earth was not the center, and that Aristotle was wrong. But we didn't have any other new theory to fix all that stuff. We just knew that Aristotle was wrong and Copernicus was wrong. Imagine having grown up in a world of Lysenkoist, Stalinist orthodoxy, with the rare exception of the rando Trotskyists out there somewhere in the wild. But imagine having grown up in a world of a pretty radical Marxist orthodoxy, and all of a sudden that's not available to you anymore, really. And Althusser took it upon himself to read Marx and to be like, what is going on here? And I find that to be extremely heroic. And I don't know that anyone's done that since, with the exception maybe the analytic Marxist folks, like the no bullshit Marxist guys. But I find it to be a terribly heroic thing he did. And even if you don't agree with him, I mean, he really started a research program to be like, all right, let's reread Marx and let's try to rebuild a coherent scientific theory of history and social change out of the ashes of Stalinism. I really, and he did that on top of the fact that he was suffering from profound mental health stuff. To me, it's quite heroic.
I mean, it's interesting to me too, because one of the things I remember the critiques of Althusser is that he was really a Stalinist, and I remember like accepting that for a long time, and then going through his late works and talking about no, what he was trying to do was like wrestle their critique of Stalin away from this more rightward oriented social democratic concessionary stuff coming out of Khrushchev. But he felt like he needed to put the groundwork in first, and he found some hope in Mao. But what the French really knew about what was going on in China was actually not particularly great. So he's, operating from that perspective. And I'm with you. My critiques of Althusser tend to be more based of like what he thought science was, which was very common in the 50s and 60s in France. But like, it's kind of foreign to us now. Like, no one's going to go to like 19th century structural linguistics as a model for science today.
I don't know. I guess this is where I might respectfully disagree and to say that linguistics is a science, and that it was a conceptual framework by which it was a scaffolding by which to build something else. And I think Althusser admitted as much. But also, I think he couldn't do it, and I'm not sure that I think that scaffolding went a long way, and I do think that the kind of movements that Althusser made, to me, I think they're accurate. I think that they're representative of an authentic Marxism, and I think that Poulantzas and those guys gave some of the best analysis of fascism ever made, and that ain't nothing. I mean, they're real gains to be made out of Althusser's development of ideology, ISAs and RSAs. That there's just no modern. Those ideas have even gotten down into liberalism, where we can talk about, kind of. No one's going to call it false consciousness, but the kind of Zizekian thing he does. I think even people now, liberals, can admit that the system has the capitalist mode of production has the ability to engage in some kind of mind control, and that's much more derivative of Althusser than it is from orthodox Marxism.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, and that when we talk about orthodox Marxism, everyone always puts Althusser and Lukács up against each other, and I actually found that kind of funny because I'm like, Lukács is not particularly orthodox either.
Yeah, no, he was denounced. He was denounced as one of the professors by Zinoviev. And again, this is a place where I have to admit, I think I maybe say this somewhere, is that the sober me is a very much an Althusserian structuralist. But there's something about that. The more mystical religious part of me is very much driven to Lukács. Although I will say this, that everyone reads History and Class Consciousness, and that text does read very Hegelian and very kind of loosey-goosey. But if you study Lukács's later stuff in terms of like his social ontology, it reads much more structuralist.
Oh yeah.
And so, And also, maybe the other thing I'll say about Lukács there is that there was and Lucian Goldman makes this argument, and I think he's right, that the 20th century was going to be a metaphysical debate between Lukács and Heidegger, and Lukács lost, Heidegger won, and I think that was like, if people want to talk about how philosophy went off the rails,
Heidegger.
Yeah. But
Yeah.
it's Heideggerian move that Heidegger won the day, and that this kind of language mysticism masquerading as metaphysics, that won the day, and that led into the what I think is the intellectual gutter that is post-structuralism and deconstruction and all that. That is all downstream of the fact that that at the end of the day, when liberal intellectuals had to choose between changing the world or living in a dream, they decided to live in a dream. And Lukács was thrown under the bus, and history and class consciousness was not the modality by which people began to analyze the structure of being in consciousness.
Well, I was recently rereading the massive tome that is Destruction of Reason, which I agree with you is a lot more systematic and structural than history and class consciousness. There's not as much stuff about like emergent totalities that I have to figure out like how you could possibly know when they were beforehand, and it doesn't seem like there's any way to that you get in history and class consciousness where it's just like, okay, so we know when the workers' revolution has happened, when the workers' revolution has happened.
Yeah.
Like,
it's the Hegelian stuff. Yeah, it's a very Hegelian stuff.
Which, well, and the Hegelian stuff makes sense when you're reading Hegel through the lens of like religion, or when you remember that the absolute idea is like freedom manifested in the world through divine intervention, but since it has to be divine intervention negatively because you still have to be free to act, blah 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 blah, and like that makes sense. In a materialist framework, that's harder to make sense of.
Like, it's a lot harder, but it's still not impossible. And I tell people there's a whole class I would love to do with a bunch of Marxists that I'll never do, which I would teach I would teach Hegel's philosophy of right, and because that's the real whipping boy of Marxist critique of Hegel. It's the big thing. We have an actual, we actually have a commentary on the last chunk of it. I'd just read it backwards and see if anyone disagreed with it. It's like, all right, let's start with the actual society and go backwards. And reading the philosophy of right, which is Hegel's last book in an important sense. Now it's hard to find where exactly I totally disagree with it, reading it one direction. And yeah, I think that with Lukács applies that stuff back in, or interpolates that stuff back in, there's a kind of intellectual coziness to it, because it is the framework out of which Marxism was born, but it has this mystical feel to it, which again I'm seduced by, and I am very seduced by it, which should be unsurprising.
Yeah. As a person who comes out of a Marxist background and who analyzes religion through, you talk about this as a dialectical and historical materialist analytic of religion, which I did not get from your show. I've watched your show for about 2 years, and I did not initially get that. But I get it more now because you're always historically contextualizing these somewhat obscure religious movements and figures that really, and trying to get back to how to read them in their context, in their material history, and then walking through both kind of material history and the reception history and how those are interacting and changing these ideas. And when it comes to the history of like esoterica, interestingly, a lot of people do that, which I find fascinating, because these are religious ideas, and it wouldn't, unless you are a mystic, most people would not do that. But the scholarship on that tends to be fairly materialist, right? What I find interesting when we do that would say Marx, Lenin, Stalin, etc., we don't tend to do that. There's not this tend to go back and recontextualize the debates. The first person for me who kind of tried to do that I read, there's two, was Althusser, and from a completely different modality, Hal Draper, trying to go back and like find the debate that was actually leading to this term to emerge, etc. Um, and I guess I was going to ask you, do you see a relationship in the methodology that we're talking about here? We're dealing with trying to figure out what Marx thought or how that changed over time and led to these orthodoxies and new theories, et cetera, and how these esoteric ideas play out. Because your show and then the Secret History of Western Esotericism, and then me actually reading the books that come up on those shows, have really changed my view of the way we should study philosophy in light of both that they almost always have more religious content than we recognize initially for these reasons, like we're reading them decontextually, and two, we often don't recognize the shifts in religious thought in them because we don't recognize the religious thought at all, and that comes from the same bad methodology. And while what happens in Marxism isn't the same as that at all, there is this tendency to be like, well, you know, Marx said X, this comes from this tradition, we can find it in, you know, from a decontextualized quote from X and Y, and then bracket out all the debates. I mean, the famous one is like trying to figure out what dictatorship of the proletariat meant originally versus later. Do you think that these two things interrelate at all?
I think they should. I mean, I've always been I guess I can say it maybe this way. I didn't come out of a Marxist family. I came out of a working class Mississippi family, and I came to be a Marxist because I like poured the sweat out of my boot one day, and I read Marx in high school because we had to, and you know my teacher just railed against Marx and his evil communism. And I just remember reading about this guy talking about how you know production mattered and workers mattered, and I remember pouring the sweat out of my boot and being like, I like this guy, like you know, and so I kind of came into working class politics and Marxism as a working class person, and I really bought the whole, you know, and it's also skeptical of Marx. I didn't trust the way he dressed, and I didn't trust the way he looked. He looked too fancy, like he didn't look like me. He looked like my dad, and and this guy is like, yeah, this is one of those kind of people that gets it right, but like he's probably not trustworthy, and for me, there was never a desire to like do hagiography of Marx. He doesn't need to be a saint. You know, I don't need Trotsky or Stalin or Mao to be saints. I need them to be revolutionaries, and that's a messy business. And for me, it's always a question of if I really want to understand these guys, I have to get into the mess, and that was always like the case because I didn't trust them. Like they don't look like how many days in a factory did Trotsky work? You know, first thing about factories. You know, to Simone Weil's point. So it's easy for me to it's always been easy for me to go to Marx and say like, all right, I think he gets this right, but he's not God. He's not the damn Messiah. He's just some guy. And he's punching in the dark half the time as much as any of us are. And when he's right. And when he's not. And it's fine. And when I just apply that same sort of, or rather I should say that, again, this is where I come to structuralism kicks in. I don't analyze history in terms of individuals. That's like a liberal, great man of history way of telling history. It's not a Marxist way of telling history. But individual people are nodes. They're intersections of historical structural forces. And those historical structural forces, economic forces, like political forces, religious forces, the individuality, the individual subject is only intelligible as an emergence from that field, an excitation in that field of force. And to think that somehow they figured it out is a betrayal of historical materialism. It's bizarre. And so in the same way that, you know, you don't understand that person because there's nothing there to understand, because a person is just a cipher of that tangle of forces. And so whether it's Marx or Trotsky or whatever, or Hildegard of Bingen, or to me, it's all the same thing. And so when I when I go to study Marx and Marxism, or when I go to study Mechthild and Magdeburg, I'm always asking the same questions. Like, what's their class position? What's their class origin? What's their class trajectory? What are the economic forces? What are the military forces? How does Mechthild get enough calories in her body to survive? And I begin to build a story, an analysis of the vectors of the forces that she is the emergence of. And at the very tip of that emergence is her.
Mm-hmm.
But when we pretend that she's more than that, we don't understand her in her concrete conditions. And so that's what I do. And that's why, when I analyze stuff on the channel, and this is maybe a fault of mine, and maybe I could do a better job of this, is that there's no interiority for many of the people I study on the channel. You don't get a sense of them as people. Like, you never get, I never tell fun stories about their personality or something, which is what I think a lot of other YouTube channels do when it goes to historical figures. They're like, let's talk about how Grant was a drunk when he was bored, or it's always it's like, what does their Facebook profile look like if they were a person? I'm like, I don't care about that at all, because none of that's real. And so I don't analyze these characters and people that way. I say, this is the historical context, and they're an emergence out of that context, and they're nothing other than an emergence out of that context, any more than anyone else, any other subject is anything other than an excitation in a field of forces.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think about you mentioned Althusser. I use Bakhtin a lot for understanding this, like understanding the utterance of an individual, in the context that in that utterance is all this other social stuff, both their material surroundings that you talked about, but also like the social consensus around these words at the time they're being used, and the fact that people often have counter registers in what they're saying. I mean, we talk about this in a little bit. I think it's indicated a lot in Marx. Like, there's these ambiguities that you can kind of piece apart, and they can go in multiple different directions. Like, I'm not one to say, for example, that Stalinism or Soviet orthodoxy or Maoism, are Maoisms, which there's at least 5 now formally or something like that. I've tried to like map them out before. That any of those aren't related to Marxism because of some small deviation, because in some sense I'm always like, usually it's not a deviation, it's an ambiguity that leads to a shift in time, right?
Yeah. It's a butterfly effect. There's some ambiguity in Marx that's worked itself out in some kind of bizarre way in the actual application of these ideas.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting to me because way back before I decided to become something really lucrative, like a poet and a teacher, I was training to be a religious anthropologist. So anthropologist of religion, actually. That's a confusing way to say it. But and I do think, even though I do not think Marxism is a religion in if religion has any meaning at all, I'm not sure that it does on Marxism probably isn't one, but that way in which unintended ideas and counter registers and stuff show up in time is really interesting, because the way I do go about this and the way I would go about something like analyzing developments around Bible verses or something like that, they are weirdly similar. Like, you're just like, okay, so there's this ambiguity in this part of this text, and we don't know this, but in this political context it's going to work out in a certain way, and now we have a tradition, and it's going to, and boom. Like, do you so and thinking about the class content of it's actually interesting. I about 5 or 6 years ago I started thinking about the class of, like, how do we understand the class of biblical authors? Asterisk, we can't understand them in classes that we know, because the classes that we are predominantly in today barely existed, if at all, in the first century CE. So how when you approach some of these figures, how do you figure out their class origins and all this to figure out what their meaning may have been?
Yeah, I mean, I locate them in the system of production, right? We know a good bit about. I mean, Europe is pretty well understood in terms of the system of production, but I mean, even
Mm,
we can go back further than that. I mean, one of the best books ever written, in my opinion, a book I rely on heavily, is "Class Struggle in the Ancient World." So one of the
mm,
most amazing pieces of scholarship, Marxist or otherwise. So I do think we can do class analysis, and I think we do class analysis by understanding, the forces and mode of production, the social relations of production, and we began to locate these figures in that. And I can think of someone like Mechtilde Magdeburg, right? Like, this is a woman who's living in a world where there are certain kinds of forces of production, but also she's able to live in a sort of micro society where there's cottage industry and stuff like that. And so it's a sort of a part of a really early version of a kind of bourgeois consciousness. And I mean bourgeois in the very progressive sense of that term, when Marx calls the bourgeoisie the most successful revolutionary class in history. Uh, People like Mechthild are some of the very first people for whom that radical subjectivity is very much linked to their social independence, because of the fact that they have access to communally owned cottage industry within these Beginhofen. And so it's unsurprising to me that these Begins all began to develop this crazy, radically independent religious poetry, because there's something like bourgeois intellectuals, or very early examples of something like bourgeois intellectuals, for whom their subjectivity is the object of endless interest, in the same way that the early Dutch capitalists were some of the first people to endlessly want to see themselves depicted in art.
mm.
That there's an obsession with their own subjectivity. So yeah, I think that one can. I think it's just a question of doing the difficult work of trying to sort out, where they fit in their class origin, their class position, their class trajectory. Those three things mapped onto the forces and relations of production. And yeah, it takes some work, but it's really not impossible. But and also, again, like, I'm thinking of Mechtil because I just did an episode on her. But thinking about where she came from, like, okay, what does it mean to come from a minor aristocratic family? What does it mean to leave that family? What are you going to leave it for? Why does she not go to an enclosure?
Mm.
There are places for aristocrat girls to go. Cistercians were packed to the brim with aristocrat girls. Like, why does she go to the Beginhof, not to the Cistercian enclosure? What's going on there? So yeah, you can begin to ask these questions, and I can tell you that I lay in bed thinking about them. And it's I don't talk about those questions on the channel because there's a lot of like speculation on my part. But I can definitely guarantee you that by the time I'm writing an episode, I've come to some kind of conclusions um, about those questions, at least as best as I can, given the evidence I have access to. And yeah, it lends to the analysis that I provide, and I think people find it to be an interesting analysis. And I've gotten emails from lots of scholars being like, "I watched your episode on this, and was didn't really think about this that way." And I'm like, "Yeah, just you're probably a liberal, not thinking about it as and exactly the same way that I am."
I was, yeah, I think about that a lot. I do think, when we're talking about like late medieval, early modern mystics, it is a little easier than when like we're dealing with like trying to figure out the class orientation of like the Jesus movement. I remember reading a book that we published over at Zero when I worked for them. It was one of the last books I accepted. It was about like Jesus's relationship to class struggle, asterisk, and they're not really talking about Jesus. They're talking about the early Jesus movement because we don't really know anything about Jesus the person. Um, but it was interesting, trying to figure that out because on one hand, there is this, a tradition even in socialism. You can go back and read Kotsky's like Christianity and socialism, or
Mm-hmm.
whatever, and he's basically, Christianity is the religion of the little guy. When you actually read it, you're like, well, sort of, but it's not aimed at like these texts are not aimed at the little guy. For one, they're texts. They're aimed at somebody. The theory that I've seen around some more recent Marxist scholarship is they're aimed at they're coming from a merchant class speaking for a peasant class, aimed at the outliers of the elite. That's who they're targeting, right? And that creates a very complicated picture for analyzing those texts, because it does explain the first will be last stuff, but it also explains why there's this weird there is not a vision of inverting or getting rid of empire. There's only universalizing empire and making it more humane and under God as opposed to some ruler, right? And stuff like that. So you start looking at that, and a lot of it's highly speculative. We can't really know.
Yeah, you have to be able to figure out what you think Jesus really said, and
right. Or at least what early Jesus movement thought he said.
No, right. And I do think a lot of that's recoverable to some degree. I tend to be a bit more lenient with that stuff, but yeah, I think we get some sense of where Jesus as an individual. We have a sense of the historical Jesus, and I think that the Jesus movement, as it begins to emerge in the second century, that's a whole different ball of wax, because by the second century, even by the Gospel of John, they've escaped their Jewish origins, right? They're no longer, and even by Paul, they're beginning to shake off that stuff, and so you get a sense that even by the time of the composition of the Gospels, there's already a rewriting of the story, specifically in the exoneration of Pontius Pilate, where they're more self-consciously courting empire than resisting it. I don't think that was true of Jesus. I think Jesus himself was a kind of apocalyptic anti-imperialist, not actively thinking of overthrowing the empire through armed struggle, but basically thinking that God was going to do it through some messianic character, perhaps himself. But yeah, I think you can see this, and I think you can see it. You can do the class analysis again, thinking about. This is where again I think that some Maoist stuff is really useful to really think about sort of center and periphery of empire, and the kind of contradictions that emerge at the periphery of empire. Fanon is useful here as well. So I think those tools are useful, and this is where I'm quite a heterodox Marxist. That when I think Trotsky gets it right, I think combined and even development and permanent revolution are correct. I think that Mao's understanding of dialectics as contradictions is also correct. I'm not going to get shoved into some thing where I can't, at some level appreciate where I think the tradition gets things right and where I think they get things wrong. But again, I think these are places where we can do those kinds of analysis. But admittedly, as the data becomes scarce, and the data is scarce, as you point out, our analysis becomes lower and lower and lower resolution. And so, yeah, our level of analysis of Jesus is always going to be a relatively low resolution analysis, but that's fine.
I mean, we do have hints. I mean, for example, the complications and even grammatically in the Gospels, they amp up significantly between Mark to Matthew and Luke, and then way significantly in John, where there's no way that John doesn't know some Neoplatonism. There's absolutely no way.
I mean, or just where we get the jump from blessed are the poor to blessed are the poor in spirit.
Yeah.
That's a hell of a change, that's from I think that's from Mark to Matthew, and so clearly, Matthew is already on the trajectory away from the kind of radicalism, social radicalism that Jesus spoke. Although I don't buy the whole kumbaya Jesus stuff. I think Jesus was a very very militant, very very elitist Jew, Jewish supremacist of a certain type. And I don't buy the whole he was expecting a universal reconciliation. I mean, you see some of the the discussion with the Samaritan woman, or he's like, I'm not going to help you, and she's like, well, don't even dogs get to eat the crumbs that fall from the table. And he's like, oh, I'll give you the crumbs. That's Jesus talking. That's the historical Jesus talking. That's the Jewish ethnocentric theology that you'll get the crumbs, but ultimately we will inherit the world. And I think that the Kumbaya Jesus that we get in John, but also the Kumbaya Jesus that we get out of Hegel and Zizek, where you get this sort of universalized religion. That's not Jesus. That's not what he actually thought. And when you actually read the texts that we think are relative, pretty likely by him, he's not on your team. He's much more on the team of like, apocalyptic settlers in Palestine right now.
Yeah, well, I mean, the Jesus that I tend to believe, the Jesus I tend to believe existed. A Jewish Buddhist, I don't believe in Jesus as a metaphysical thing at all. But I tend to agree with E.P. Sanders, like that it was an apocalyptic, rarely ethnocentric, probably closer to Qumran than not. Like, that's my take.
Yeah, I mean, his cousin John the Baptist certainly was quite close to that community in some ways. It seems like,
Mm-hmm.
And also we know that the Qumran community was an extreme version of the Essenes. It seems like they were a strict version of a movement that did have popular out branches. And also, again, like peasants are quasi peasant people like Jesus. We never see Jesus in a major city. He's always in the countryside. He's always out somewhere. He's never in like teaching in Nazareth, or he's in Capernaum. He's in a synagogue once or twice. He's always kind of in the countryside, and you get the sense that he's, I mean, again, not the Maoist version of him like raging up a countryside army or whatever, but you get the sense that he's at the periphery of the society he's in, and that he's sort of touching to these radical movements, and people at the periphery of societies come up with a lot of strange ideas, and they often can be very charismatic, and I think Jesus was one of these characters, and we see a lot of those in history. It's a lot of these messianic characters who are able to convince a lot of people to do a lot of weird stuff.
Well, that's it is interesting. I one of the things I've looked at in anthropology is just looking at where people are physically, and you're like, you go to the mountains and you just meet like there's probably 1,000 different radical epistemologies in like 2 mountains, because no one agrees on anything. Like, even if the only thing they agree with is they want to be left alone, that's why I'm on the side of the mountain in the first place. Like, and the core and periphery stuff is very useful for understanding even those dynamics. The further away from the city you go, the less homogenous people get, despite what you might think. So
and the more intellectually daring and like unhinged. And I tell this to people: go out in the countryside anywhere and just like talk to people. There's a weird, bizarre idea that, and this has been so much more true because of mass media, but back before the mass media, urban centers were intellectually much more homogenous than the countryside, because you're left alone for long periods of time to think, and people got up to all kinds of weird beliefs. But yeah, I think that I mean, again, there's like this Maoist Jesus that I think some people have adopted, and I think that's true. But but yeah, I do think that we can do, again, low resolution class analysis, given the paucity of the data, but still some analysis.
Well, this leads me to an interesting question. When you're dealing with groups like the Gnostics, where, and I'm gonna put Gnostics in quotation marks because I got to put like 50 asterisks and like whether or not they're even real as a category. See this in this book. But like, but like say let's pick one. Let's say Marcion. Okay. Like, what kind of class milieu are we dealing with there? Like,
well, we know Marcion for sure. Marcion was a owner of a shipping business. So he came from, he was
good old proto bourgeois. Like,
I mean, I would say, I mean, like really sort of like the closest thing the Roman Empire ever produced, like to a bourgeois class. I mean, he was a captain of industry. So he ran a shipping business. He was able to. I think when he came to Rome, he donated like 200 sestertians to the church. Like, it's just 3 years' wages or whatever for like a craftsperson. Like, it was real money. And and he basically was able to bankroll his own church. So we know a lot about his class background. He's sort of the second century equivalent to. I mean, I don't know exactly, some kind of Gilded Age, Gilded Age guy. I think he inherited the business from his father. So yeah, we know a good bit about him, and but again, this is an interesting place, right, where the church wasn't able to be bought off. He basically said, like, "Hey, I want you to do this, that, and the other," and the church was like, "No, we're not doing that," and they gave his money back. So this is an interesting moment where the early Catholic, proto-Catholic church could not be bought by this guy. And so he had to basically buy his own church, and it did survive. I mean, Marcionite churches existed in the Eastern Mediterranean in 5th or 6th centuries or something like that. So yeah, we know a good bit about his class background and him. When it gets more murky is like Valentinus. Like, I mean, he obviously is literate. He is he's able to compete for the bishop seat of Rome in the 180s, I think 170s. He's in competition for the bishop of Rome. That's no small thing. It's not the Pope as it is now, but that's no joke. And it scared Irenaeus enough that Irenaeus went back to Lyon and wrote the Ad Horaris. So yeah, like Valentinus is coming from some kind of money. We don't know exactly what, but so yeah. So we know a good bit about him. In general, it seems that so-called Gnosticism was a relatively, I wouldn't say elite, but literate group of people. And part of what I would say about that is that if the texts survive in some number, but also those texts are complicated enough that they would require a good deal of education to have a grasp of what's going on in them. And so yeah, we have some sense of those guys.
Well, I bring it up because there's a lot of people who read Gnosticism. I think this was more popular in like the popular scholarship 30 years ago. I remember when I was in high school, like the Elaine Pagel School of Interpretation.
Yeah.
It makes it sound like they were a besieged minority, and they might have been, but they had to be from a relatively elite position. When you go through and like, okay, there's all this symbolism there. The more I've studied it as an adult, there's all this relationship to Neoplatonic philosophy. So these people have some kind of relationship to like official state educational institutions that they're dealing with, are quasi-official. I mean, it's hard to talk about official state educational institutions in the 1st century and the 3rd century, but like something like that.
I think even more to your point that there isn't official institutions of higher learning and they have instant access to education, which means they're procuring it through private contracting, often through buying slaves. People forget that slaves in the Greek and Roman world often could be educated. Were often educated. If you wanted to learn to do poetry, you would often hire a slave that could teach you how to do poetry. So this was not the chattel slavery of the American South, but rather a quite different kind of highly skilled slavery. Often, of course, some of it was menial slavery and chattel slavery as well. But yeah, it's definitely the case that they may have been a beleaguered minority, but that's also because Christianity was just a minority. I mean, most of this stuff is seemingly being generated in Egypt, Alexandria. We don't know in absolute numbers how much Christians represented a percent of the population, but they weren't a majority, and they wouldn't become a majority for quite some time. And they wouldn't exercise enough authority until they got imperial power in the 4th century. So when so-called Gnosticism is being developed in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, yeah, all these groups are relatively small. But we don't know. I mean, you can try to generate some numbers from the papyrological remains, but then you do that and you're like, the survivorship bias is gonna haunt you. You're never gonna know, whether or not something survived because it was numerous or survived because it was an accident, or
Survived just because it was in Egypt where the conditions are good for shit for
Well,
surviving.
that's why everything survived in Egypt. So it's definitely the case that we should. And again, also when you measure things based on what you find in Egypt, can you apply that to Gaul? Can you apply that to Rome, or conditions or intellectual conditions in Rome similar to Alexandria? I mean, and can you derive something about the conditions in Alexandria from what survives in one grave in Nagamati? I think it's bad. That's bad methodology.
Mm-hmm.
Brian Nogary has a great book on uh, books. The earliest Christian archaeological evidence we have are books. That's the earliest evidence we have of Christianity. There are no churches from that time period. Everyone's meeting in houses, and so we don't know what's a house and what's a church, and there's probably no difference, frankly. And so we don't really have a lot of archaeological evidence of Christianity in the first few centuries of its history. What we do have are books. We have manuscripts. And so what can we learn about that? What can we do with, again, this is sort of where Marxism kicks in. I like those studies because they start with what we have. And what we have are books. So what do we know about how long it takes to make a book? How much do books cost? Who are buying them? Who's selling them? Who's reading them? When we notice that the Apocryphon of John has been translated into 2 different dialects of Coptic, what does that tell us? That's conspicuous. That means that we have a Greek original that's been translated at least twice into Coptic, into one dialect at one point of the Nile, then in one dialect a little bit further up the Nile. That's interesting, because that means that, and the dialects are relatively mutually intelligible, but it's interesting to note that meant that 2 people that seemingly didn't know one another decided that it was important enough that this text be translated into that regional dialect of Coptic. What does that mean? And I think those are interesting questions. I think those are to me, that's really where you get the materiality. What does it mean to choose to do that? Translate that book into that dialect of Coptic, as opposed to the 1,000 other things that person could have done. And then we begin to get I think a richer picture of the complicatedness that is early Christianity or Gnosticism or whatever.
Yeah, early Christianity, Gnosticism. I think we can do this even with Pharisaic thought too. I mean, when do we get manuscripts? Where are they coming from? How are they being preserved? Why is the Babylonian one more important than the Jerusalem one? That's not immediately obvious to non-Jews and people who don't understand the history. You learn a lot about relative status of diaspora populations, for example. Right. Based on what you find in the different Talmuds.
The fact that the Jerusalem Talmud has the section on agriculture is 3 times bigger.
Right.
And you begin to think, oh yeah, because they're living on farms. Jewish farming is a thing in Israel, Palestine, in a way that it wasn't for the urban elite living in Babylonia, who were living in what is now Fallujah. They didn't have questions around what to do with farming because they weren't engaged in. They were buying their food rather than growing it. And yeah, that's exactly right. And
it means something different there too than when we look at late medieval Jewish manuscripts in Europe, where they can't farm even if they wanted to.
Right. And why? And it's interesting. Why would they preserve sections about farming when that's not even possible?
Right.
What is the sort of impetus for preserving a text that that isn't even applicable any longer and won't be applicable in the conceivable future? Yeah, I think these questions are, again, and again, this is when I do my work. I proceed very slowly to think through these questions, because I do think that they are revelatory of the actual people and their actual history. The texts, again, are an emergence out of a system of interconnected forces, and until you get a good grasp on those forces, all you have is a cipher, and the text doesn't really mean anything, or it can't mean anything. So this is why I think that historical materialism for me is so important as a methodology.
Well, I guess this is a good place to talk about, and this is be the last section of our conversation, but why study esoteric stuff in a historical materialist framework? I mean, yes, you and I are both in some way quasi-religious. I don't actually know. I mean, I would assume you're an observant Jew, but By observant, probably in like the Reconstructionist tradition, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a very old school Kaplanian, follower of Mordecai Kaplan.
Yeah. For I have that book back there somewhere.
Judaism as Civilization.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great book. That's my.
Yeah. Uh, that's one of the few books that's ever got me to step into a shul.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, thank Baruch Hashem.
But nonetheless, why is it I'm not saying it actually is important actually, but why could it be in theory important to study these ideas this way?
I guess a couple of reasons. One reason is that a lot of people who've studied esotericism have studied it either to dismiss it as not worthwhile of being historical, like it's just not, like it didn't happen, or who cares, or it's like not an important part of history, which is empirically false. Like these ideas have had an enormous impact on the development of Western thought, whether that thought be religious or philosophical or whatever. So the erasure of it is simply a historical mistake. The other side that people tend to be is credulous. They go to this material because they want it to be true. They go there because they think that magic is real, and if they study John Dee's manuscript, they can summon angels and get a girlfriend or something. I don't know.
I wouldn't go to John Dee for relationship advice, but whatever.
No, I wouldn't either. You can ask Joan Dee about that. And I guess another third position is that there's sort of like there's just an army of liberal historians.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think liberal historians, especially like with these, like the rise of like Foucauldian history, I don't trust that stuff. I don't trust the sort of post-structuralist Foucauldian shift toward so-called genealogy or whatever they made up stuff they call it.
Genealogy, epistemes, and those fun little like
all that stuff. Yeah, I don't get down with that, and because I don't think that's really history. I don't know what that is. It's like historical fiction. I don't know what it is. And so I don't trust any three of those ways of doing history.
Mm-hmm.
And it just so happens that for whatever reason, as a quirk of my personality or whatever, I just happen to be interested in this material, and I happen to have a skill set that allows me to do it. I read Latin. I'm a calligrapher, so I can like read medieval manuscripts. It just so happens that I have the weird skill set that makes it so that I can do this work at a relatively granular level. And if folks have watched the channel, like I'll show you the manuscript that I'm reading, like on the screen, like, and I'll zoom in on it and be like, that's the part. And so it just so happens that I have a weird skill at this. And so if you have a weird skill at something and you can benefit the field, then you should do it. And it just so happens that I'm able to do it, and thankfully I'm able to make a living at doing it, which is not true for a lot of academics. So yeah, that's my bit. I mean, and I guess the other side of it is, not only has this material had a pretty decisive impact in history, but many of the ideas are very current. They're with us now. My fellow Mississippian Bill Faulkner said that the past isn't dead; it's not even past. We're still living, as I mentioned earlier, right? We're still living in Joachim Fior's world. We still talk about the Middle Ages, like that language is apocalyptic language. It's baked into the way that we interact with our world. And the more that we have an understanding of the historical processes that have generated the present, the more that we might have some ability to shape these historical processes in the interest of human liberation. And if we, as chauvinist Marxists, turn our nose up to the history of esotericism and the history of mysticism and the history of magic, ironically, we're turning our nose up at history, which is about the least historical materialist thing you can do. But also, you're turning your nose up to an important dimension of how ideas were formed and how they shaped reality and how they were shaped by reality. But also, I'll give the example of magic. You're also turning your nose up about how common everyday people, working people, dealt with their reality.
Mm-hmm.
And like, I think that when your when your Marxism means turning your nose up at working class people, peasants, laboring people, I don't know what kind of hell Marxism that is. I don't have anything to do with that. And so part of what I'm able to do is in my work, I'm able to center common people, regular people, and say like, this is a place where religion was functioning at this very weird way. And that we think that we tell the story that the Catholic Church had hegemony and blah, 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 but that's not true. There were peasants who clearly were not impressed by the hegemony of the Catholic Church and were using magic to try to get stuff done. That shows you already there's an intellectual insurrection against the hegemony of the Catholic Church. So if we're going to do the history, we need to do the history. And if we're going to do it, then I think we should do it in a way that centers people and common people, regular people, minority people, like Mechthild of Magdeburg, who's a woman writing a daring book in the 13th century, where she knows that and a generation later, her colleague Marguerite Porete will be burned for writing something similar. These are really heroic people, and they're doing something that really is like disrupting the hegemonies around them, whether that be patriarchy or the hegemony of scholasticism or the church as a hegemonic power. There's some revolutionary energy there, and I think that and again, not to get all micro revolution stuff, I don't want to go into that kind of stuff, but I think that there's revolutionary energy there, and I think there are moments where we can really get a glimpse into how radically important these figures are and these movements are. And I think that any Marxism that doesn't want to get granular like that isn't really historical materialism. It's some liberal, positivist, Whiggish history is all about dudes on battlefields.
Yeah.
That's not true.
I mean, that is weirdly an implication of a lot of Marxist studies, as we study philosophers and statesmen and often not actual people. Like the number of Marxists who judge the Soviet Union off of daily life in the Soviet Union and what they were and were not achieving in absolute terms is actually pretty damningly rare.
Yeah.
I
agree.
I remember studying like calorie inputs in the USSR and being fascinated by it because it told a very different story, even from the Soviet Union's own records, which is harder and harder to get access to. Thank you, Putin. But there was, like, unfortunately, we had a bright spot in this period of Soviet scholarship from like 1996 to like 2009, and it's back closed off again. So,
right.
Maybe
a real pity. But yeah, I agree with you that I think Marxists have to start, in my opinion, with the forces and relations of production, the mode of production, and you build your history from there. Because, like you said, if you can't get calories in your mouth, well, you're not gonna have a society much longer. And
right.
Like I said, I want to agree. I agree with you, and that's the kind of history that I want to do. And I don't see that kind of history much on the internet. Most guys who do history on the internet are just like, they just want to do like battlefield reenactment. Like, this is the Battle of Austerlitz. Let's talk about the Battle of Austerlitz for 5 hours. I'm like, I don't want to talk about the Battle of Austerlitz obviously matters, but what matters just as much of that, in fact, more than that, is how all those guys end up on that battlefield and who's feeding them. Like, where does that gunpowder come from? Who made those cannons? There's a pyramid of causality, and without understanding the foundations, the substructure of that causal network, you don't get a Battle of Austerlitz. You don't get cannons. You don't get food. You don't get uniforms. And again, I really don't. I don't want anyone to hear me just hating on military history people, but there's often this weird presumption that that, like you said, it's philosophers, scientists, statesmen, and generals that make history. But those are not what make those are not what are ultimately decisive of historical shifts. Class struggle is what is ultimately decisive of historical shifts. And if insofar as Marx is right, that class is the unit of social selection in the way that the gene is the unit of biological selection. If class is the unit of social selection, and class again is about position, origin, and trajectory, then we have to be studying that at the very beginning of what we're doing. Otherwise, I don't know what it is. Otherwise, it's doing bourgeois history.
Well, yeah. Although a lot of people that we were talking about wouldn't have a problem being called a bourgeois historian, even if they knew what it meant.
Yeah,
but
and again,
yeah.
they're not. What I'm saying is they're not wrong.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that it's not that. And again, I'm not calling them out. What I'm saying is Marxist historians need to start doing Marxist mystery. I'm just saying, like, we need to do our job better. Not that they need. Not that they don't need to do their job. Military history obviously is very important. It's just that we need to be doing. Marxists need to be doing their job better.
Absolutely.
That's who I'm. That's who. If I'm calling anybody, it's myself.
No, I mean, well, Marxist historiography, to me, there's two areas where Marxism should be strong, and that is economic analysis and historiography and history. And while Marxist historiography is still actually weirdly kind of respected by a lot of bourgeois historians, even though they consider it outdated and outmoded, it's not like shut on like Marxist economics is.
Yeah.
But it is weird to me that, like, no, what we have now is critical. Like, I like Frederick Jameson as much as the next person, but I don't actually need another literary understanding of capital. That's, to me, that's kind of the opposite of what we should be doing.
Yeah. No, I agree. I mean, if we could have 15 more books like Class Struggle in the Ancient World, books like that's the kind of stuff we need.
Yeah.
And I don't know. Maybe I'll write some class, sort of like some Marxist thing about Western esotericism at some point, but I don't know. It's not in the near future. I can tell you that.
Yeah. Well,
just getting the basic texts out there. Is that's going to be a lifetime's worth of work on my part.
So on that note, I'm gonna have you plug your stuff. The weirdest part about doing a political socialist podcast is the fact that because it's a podcast, we still have to do rentier relations part of the show. But nonetheless, where can people find your work? And also, maybe I would add to that, in addition to your work, what would you suggest people who've had their curiosity piqued, they go to your channel, what would you suggest? What other channels would you tell them to look at, and what might you tell them to read that we haven't mentioned in the interview today?
And the only social media that I have is just my YouTube channel. It's just Esoterica. That's
smart.
like my thing. Yeah, social media scares the hell out of me, so I don't do any of that. But yeah, you can check out Esoterica. I have a lot of channels that I work with pretty frequently that I think are good scholars, and who are not Marxists, but they're great scholars and they do great work. And you can see that I work with them. Their links are there on the channel. They do great work. Authentic Films is another guy I'll push. Andy is a good friend of mine, and he just did a great historical, what I would consider, I don't know that he considers himself a Marxist. I know that he doesn't, but he did basically a historical materialist analysis of the Salem witch trials. That was fantastic. He just released it a couple days ago, and I was watching it last night, and I was like, Andy, I don't know if you're officially a Marxist, but you're doing it. Whatever Marx says about ideology, right? That they do it even though they don't know that they're doing it. But Andy is like the opposite of that. He's like a Marxist, even though he doesn't know he is. So it's a fantastic episode he did on the real material conditions of the Salem witch trials. But as a book, I mean, if you're interested in Western esotericism as a field, so it's magic and mysticism and the occult and all that, I always tell people the best place to begin is Walter Hanegraaff's Western Esotericism, The Guide of the Perplexed. he's going to be releasing a new edition of it, but the edition that exists now is it's really good. And I will say that Walter is definitely not a Marxist, but he is a good historiographer. And so insofar as one of the strengths that Marxism has is good historiography, Walter is a diligent historiographer. I admire. He's a great hero of mine. I've admired his work since I was a young person, and I've been honored to sit across the table for him and have chats about stuff. But I think that's the best place to start if you want to get into this field in a non-woo way, where you're really getting into it in a historiographically rich way.
Yeah, that book, I think I got it like 2017 or something, and it blew my mind. Like, it was just like, I was like, oh, okay. Like, there's a reason why this weird obsession that I have actually has some like validity for understanding the world.
No, it's a funny moment where I think people said this about the channel. They're like, I had a weird feeling that this mattered a lot more than people make it out to be. Mm-hmm. And then they, after they watch some of my content and they read Walter's book, they're like, yeah, that's really weird that intuition proved true. And I think that everyone kind of knows it, that like these weird occult ideas played some pretty decisive. I mean, again, we don't want to go down the road, I think, of the Frances Yates thesis, where she basically says that all of modernity can be laid at the feet of Hermeticism or something like that. I don't think that's true, but she's not totally wrong either. And I think that's a moment where, I mean, I read Frances Yates' book when I was in college. Mm-hmm. And I was converted. I really believed the Yates hypothesis, and then Walter tore it apart. But I've not yet. I think Walter goes maybe a little too far in his dismissal of it. But I do think there is no modernity without it. Mm-hmm. It is. I don't know that it is either necessary nor sufficient to have produced modernity. So I'm not a Yatesian there, but I do think that there is no modernity in the way that we have modernity without it. And again, my Althusserianism kicks in and says, history is overdetermined, and this is one of the aleatory moments where the degree to which history is overdetermined, we can never know exactly what has gone into causing X, Y, and Z. But I would suggest and argue for that the Western Esotericism has had a disproportionate impact in the development of modernity in a way that I think most people don't know or appreciate.
Yeah, like we mentioned all the way back in the beginning, it's not necessary for understanding German idealism, but it sure as fuck helps. Like,
I think it is actually necessary for understanding German idealism. I do think, I do think that you can't get Schelling and other folks without it. Yeah, I do. I would go so far as to say, I don't think you can also understand the Renaissance without understanding it.
No. And also I would say you can't understand ancient Greek philosophy without having a notion of the esoteric either. So
yeah, this is a point I've made. And even rationalism, I have an episode where I talk about the dirty secret of Cartesian rationalism is that rationalism is born out of a mystical experience of bizarre dreams that Descartes had, where a divine being revealed to him the nature of rationalism. Mm-hmm. And the fact that we can't even have a conversation about that in philosophy departments, where if you bring that up, you'll get no. Shh. We don't talk about the dreams. We talk about the cogito. Yeah. I think there's no, like I said, I think history is overdetermined. So I'm not going to say I'm not going to go full Yatesian on this, but I will say that that Western esotericism has played a decisive role in the development of modernity, and to your point, to ancient Greece as well. And that if this dimension of the history is ignored, we're not doing history. Right. We're doing some Whiggish, positivist interpolation of what history should be, and that's not doing history.
Yeah, it's awfully cleaned up. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Sledge. I'm going to put a link in your show and the show notes. I actually have no idea how much our audience overlaps, but it overlaps more than I thought because you've been requested multiple times, and I was going to ask you anyway because I'm fascinated with your channel. But like, I was like, okay, weird. I had no idea that anyone else in my show, in my audience, cared about this. So, but if you're new, go check it out. I patronize you, so it comes endorsed. And thank you so much.
Yep, absolutely, man. Thank you for having me on. Great conversation.